very happy to be in Zagreb, a city I had not visited before, though I know the Croatian coast very well. We used to attend conferences in Korčula many, many years ago with some people who later betrayed everything they believed in, both Serbs and Croats. So there's an equal sign there. So it's really nice to be here again, as it was nice to be in Sarajevo and Belgrade and Novi Sad, and to get a feel of people, what they're thinking, how they're thinking, etc. So thank you very much for inviting me to this extremely energetic and lively festival. Now, I deliberately chose this subject today because we could have discussed many other things, including the United States, its wars, etc., etc. But I think it's important to discuss socialism. And why is it especially important to discuss this today? Because of the crisis that we are witnessing within the capitalist system, a crisis which many had not thought possible. Because many people assumed after the collapse of socialism and the breakup of Russia, of the old Soviet Union, of Yugoslavia, etc., that simply the fact that these countries had broken up meant that everything else was now going to be fine. It was never stated like that, but that was a deep feeling which many people had, that at last all was going to be well. But all isn't well. And all isn't well with capitalism. And it never has been. Because capitalism as a system has had recurring crises. So before talking about socialism, let us see why the idea, at least on that level, has become important again as people are searching for alternatives. The economic crisis of this latest version of capitalism, neoliberalism, has been on a huge and immense scale. And we live in a world where people have short memories, but it is worth remembering because this has only happened over the last 18 months. The scale of the crisis. The two huge mortgage companies in the United States, on which a bulk of American citizens depended on their mortgages, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, collapsed. Their shares plunged by 90%. The interesting thing is that these companies were once not privatized because they were created at the time of another huge crisis for capitalism in the 30s. And the reason for the state creating these companies was to provide cheap mortgages to working people, especially so they could buy their homes. And the fact that these mortgage companies were privatized and then collapsed again is an interesting fact. And then the government had to take them back in order not to completely to prevent the creation of mass misery in the United States. Then we had the collapse of Lehman Brothers, one of the largest firms in the United States dealing with other people's money. It went bankrupt, and the American government allowed it to go bankrupt. Then they panicked because that bankruptcy created another panic in the market. Then they pushed through shotgun marriages between huge companies so that they were forced to come together. Massive bailouts of companies running into trillions of dollars. Now think about it. We have been told for the last 25 years by the ideologues of neoliberal capitalism and by their mimics all over Europe and elsewhere in the world, that the big problem with the old system of whatever sort was the state and the power of the state. and the state must never interfere with the market, because the market provides an automatic solution for all our problems. That is what we were told. And then what happened? The market itself collapsed, and they went on its knees before the state helped us. And the state had to put the market back and pull it back up. That is essentially what happened. So in other words, it is fine for the state to help the capitalist market, but ideologically in this world, it is not fine for the state to create industries, to create employment, to build cheap houses, etc. That is not permissible. This is a big contradiction now, which these countries are facing. Because the project of neoliberalism was what? The destruction of existing structures, deindustrialization, privatization of state utilities, deregulation of the market, and the effect this had on democracy itself, which I will return to later, is therefore all to see. That if you have a social and economic system which you describe as the only system possible, then what is the point of having more than one political party? Center-left, center-right, center, all of them believe in this version of the system. And wasn't the whole point of democracy to show that many alternatives were possible and could be fought for? And if people voted for one particular alternative, they could practice it, put it into implementing. That is something that we were told was no longer possible. And this began a process of hollowing out the democratic system. Because if you have political parties which are no longer capable of explaining to the population what their basic difference is, then politics itself becomes reduced to a spectator sport, like football. And like you support different football clubs, you support political parties. And that is what politics in much of Europe under neoliberalism has been reduced to, and sometimes worse, where the institutionalized apathy created by this form of politics creates a vacuum in which far-right groups and far-right parties flourish. We see what is happening in Italy. We see what is happening in Hungary. We see some of the demonstrations that have taken place in the former Baltic republics of the Soviet Union, which were supposed to be models for the new order. We see what ultranationalism, that this breeds a form of ultranationalism because people feel they have no alternatives, and sometimes a big turn to religion. You cannot isolate the increasing religiosity that has taken place in the world from the system created by neoliberal capitalism after the collapse and fall of communism. They are related. Now, the problem is that an economic crisis on its own does not automatically produce historical events, or produce a shift to the left, or produce radical solutions. That has never happened in that shape or form. These are things that have to be fought for. And so this brings me to the question of what alternatives, what is socialism, what can we remember from the past that is worth remembering, and where we have to find new paths and solutions.